Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me and inviting me.
I'm super excited. As anybody who's watched these before knows, I've got to actually navigate a way here to, make sure that I'm kind of keeping an eye on the comments and questions we get. But before I do, I want to just give you a brief introduction to this LinkedIn community, so to speak. Emily Truelove is the manager of talent acquisition at L3 Harris. She is a recent transplant to Salt Lake City from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we actually met on the ski hill, which is pretty cool. You and your family and me and mine. But yeah, I'd love to, have you just kind of go over a brief potted history of your background. And then just to be clear, we are going to be talking about compliance, everyone's favorite. We're going to figure out a way to make this exciting, you and I.
I have a feeling that we can make it very exciting and compelling.
Indeed. So yeah, just if you could give us a brief kind of history of your background and how you came to know this topic, and I will go make sure that I'm, in the right place for comments moving forward. So I'll put myself on mute and be right back.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much, Scotty, for having me. As he said, I am Emily Truelove. I manage one of the talent acquisition functions here at L3 Harris. Prior to kind of growth into this opportunity, I never thought that I would be a recruiter. I actually kind of came into the HR function a little later in life. Started with an agency at a global scale in a life sciences practice. Ultimately made the leap over into the corporate side, also staying within life sciences, then made a jump over to defense. It's been almost 4 years that I've been in kind of the defense industry. I've had a wonderful track record of growth with different opportunities. And as Scotty kind of said, compliance, it's the nastiest word I think we can hear as HR and talent acquisition professionals, but I got a very close taste of it when I did a rotation as a talent acquisition operations manager, where I really got to see the back end, understand the why, talk through the process. And I think that there's going to be some good dialogue around just misconceptions and figuring out the why behind things, and hopefully we'll get some questions too.
I know that's just it, right? I think to your point, and thank you so much for that background. That was fantastic. But we love questions. Again, for those of you watching right now live, please pop your questions or comments into the comment section here on LinkedIn. I obviously have a list of questions myself, and I'll just admit off the top here that I am not an expert. I'd say
I'm also not an expert. I'm not an expert. I will just share throughout my career what have been the best practices and lessons learned.
You're far more of an expert than me, but I appreciate the disclaimer.
Yes.
And so, not investment advice, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think let's start with just kind of the high level, right? So if you could maybe give a bit of a definition, if you will, when we're talking about compliance as it relates to talent acquisition in HR, what exactly do we mean?
So when we talk about TA, HR, compliance, it's really coming down to the Department of Labor, which the Department of Labor has kind of two different offices. So we have the OFCCP, but then we also have the EEO. Pardon me. But this also encompasses like Department of Homeland Security. We're talking about like I-9, citizenship verifications, the right to work in the United States, AAP. There are a multitude of just different mandatory organizations that as we either onboard someone, as we interview someone, or as we retain an employee, that there's these different organizations that all roll up into the federal government that we have to follow.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. To your point, these are federal government agencies that are essentially holding us accountable. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. What would you say are the biggest misconceptions? Let's jump to that, because I think, again, somebody who's been doing this for 12 years myself, recruiting, that is, I feel like when you and I had a conversation recently, there were some misconceptions on my end. So what, in your experience, have been some of the biggest ones when you're talking to hiring managers or employees?
So I think the biggest misconception is that we have this incredible technology through our applicant tracking systems, or ATSs, that will automatically screen people, that will forward people to hiring managers, that magically this work is being done for us, and that the best qualified candidates just land in our lap and we can just shepherd them through the process quickly. And the reality is, even speaking with colleagues that work for Fortune 500 companies, other competitors, any company that's got 10,000 or more employees, even those on a global scale, or even just those that are domestically that large, we can't use that technology like that. It could exist, but because of the guidelines that we have to follow through the OFCCP and the EEOC, we have to physically look at every single resume. And that kind of goes into, I think, another topic we'll kind of dive a little more deeper into, of just, like what makes it compliant, and how do you kind of stay clean in an audit, and how do you communicate effectively to your hiring managers and your employees from that. But I think like that is the biggest misconception, is that we have this like amazing technology that does all this work for us.
Yeah, I see this often on LinkedIn, right? I spend, needless to say, a lot of time here on this platform, and see that, that misconception is just so rampant. And I've yet to discover where these AI tools are being used, right? I've seen recruiters at FANG companies say, yeah, we're not sure what you guys are referring to either. So again, that what you just described, it's, I think, super helpful for everybody watching, to understand, right?
Right. And I think it's important to note the difference, that we're talking about an applicant tracking system that is company housed and owned. Maybe it's done through a cloud. However, I am not an IT expert. I just know that I put it in there and then eventually it gets archived, or I can search for it later. But we're not talking about like the capabilities that a LinkedIn recruiter has, where you do have that ability to like really scope down and look for what you're really seeking. That's a completely different side. It's truly talking about the applicant tracking system. That is the system of record that the Department of Labor leverages.
Indeed. No, that thank you for that clarification. I think that's important. And Patrick just made the comment, I've been looking for that ATS for years.
Oh gosh, aren't we all? Like, please.
Indeed. Okay, really, really briefly for those that have joined us, I've got Emily Truelove, Manager of Talent Acquisition at L3 Harris, recent transplant from the Dallas-Fort Worth area to Salt Lake. She's going to have a booth at Silicon Slopes, folks, I think. So, make sure you go and introduce yourself, and show her that we have hospitality here in Utah too, not just in the South, or I should say in Texas. Okay, so next question, we're talking about compliance, and we've gone over the definition and some big misconceptions. What would you say when you're referring to employers or hiring managers, Emily? What are the must-know? What are the must-knows for them with regard to compliance?
So I think the must-know, and a lot of companies will do different acronyms, and thank goodness I have wonderful partners in the compliance side who I stay close with. And I've had great partners in the past with other organizations, but they try to make it very easy for us, so that as we are the mouthpiece to the hiring managers, that we're able to kind of say, here's what this is what I need from you. So we actually have an acronym that we call On Par, which essentially is just saying that anytime that we go to search and we're going external to find talent, here's an acronym to kind of remember that. So the first thing is being objective. And so what we mean by that is, are we looking for a degree in a certain swim lane? We're not looking for a tech degree from MIT. We can't, so it's being objective that, you'll hear, especially I heard it a lot when I was recruiting at the C level, where they would say, I want someone from a top 10 school. I want this, I want that. And we'd say, okay, I'm still going to present you everyone that's qualified, that meets the minimum qualifications. Non-comparative is another piece. So this is going back, we evaluate with our eyes physically. We're not using the AI technology, but it's versus, if we say that the basic qualifications are 5 years in accounting, I'm not going to just pull the top 5 candidates in the pool that have the most years of experience in accounting. I'm considering everyone that meets that minimum qualification. This one's probably the biggest sticking point that I do with managers. I talk about predetermined or advertised. So what are we putting out there and saying what we are seeking? So we're saying we're advertising for this job that's located here. This is the basic qualifications, and those qualifications need to be quantifiable. They need to be a measurable skill that we're able to look, and it can't be like great at communication. That's not measurable. So we have to really hone in on, put that on your like nice to haves, or say that part of their daily responsibilities in that top portion is that they will be responsible for being customer facing, and they'll need to prepare reports, and that senior leadership will read those reports. Weave that in there. But when it comes to those basic qualifications that we have to stick to, make those measurable, and what we're advertising, make sure that we stick to that. Relevant. Don't put a bunch of jargon and nonsense in there that no one is going to understand. And I think we see it as like full disclosure. When you get a hiring manager that comes to you and they say, hey, I want to hire someone at this kind of job, like, can you throw some job descriptions at me? Okay, well then, yeah, I'm going to go look on LinkedIn. I'm going to go pull something from a competitor. And there's been times I've pulled things. I'm like, what does this even mean? Like, as a recruiter, I need to be able to understand this. So making sure that you put that in like real digestible language, so that not necessarily the average Joe, but somebody in that field understands what you're trying to dictate and say, this is what you're going to be doing on kind of a day-to-day basis. I think the largest thing, and this kind of goes into like, if you were to get in an audit, is everything needs to be uniform and consistently applied. As long as you're practicing the same process, and in an audit, if you can demonstrate that that's the process that you follow uniformly and consistently, then your adverse action that may come at you would be quite limited. So that's what we try to kind of tell hiring managers. I think the big thing that I always try to say is, look, once we put something out there, and if we've hardlined what the basic qualifications are, the location of the job. So that's critical right now because of the remote work piece and the hybrid piece. So we say a job has to be in Salt Lake City, you better hire someone and they're in Salt Lake City. Or also funds available for relocation. So we can't hire someone for a Salt Lake City job and say, well, they live in Phoenix and they're actually going to stay in Phoenix. They're just going to work remote. It's like, well, hold on a second. We potentially lost out on a candidate pool that could have applied because we have the wrong location there. That also, that is like, I think another thing is that people don't know that like we're the lawsuit hotbed, it's true. I mean, we are the external facing. This is where we invite people into our little world of talent acquisition and you talk to external folks, and you have to be able to, in your heart of hearts, really follow those pieces so that if something were to happen, a hiring manager goes off the rails, which like we've all had someone do that. And they're like, no, I want to hire my buddy. He lives here. He's going to do great. And you're like, wonderful. We have to cancel this rec. We have to completely start over, because if you want to hire your buddy and they're going to live here, we have advertised for something completely different.
Okay. So much to unpack there.
Yes.
and I want to mention too, because I didn't mention this before asking that last question, but please, for those of you watching, if you have questions for Emily, it's obvious she's a wealth of knowledge. Please feel free to drop your questions into the comment section. Getting some great comments, some welcome to Utahs and etc.
Thank you.
But if you have questions for Emily about compliance, please let us know in the comments.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, right. But one thing that I just want to be clear on, because it's probably a misconception of mine based on everything you said, is like, so really what it comes down to here for organizations and TA is following the standards or the best practices we've set. So in other words, like, for instance, I always thought that legally we had to post a job for a certain number of days, regardless of whether or not we had somebody internally that we were thinking was going to be the fit, et cetera. And you're telling me that isn't necessarily true. Is that?
This is where we get into the fun gray area, because if you go, and I'm guilty of this because I've been through 2 OFCCP audits, but you go and you try to seek out, like, what are the guidelines I should follow? Let me just set the rules and we'll follow the rules and then we won't get in trouble. No, exactly. It's left up to interpretation. So that's when we come back to this, like, uniform and consistently applied. So let's say you work for a smaller organization, like under 500 people. Your HR function is small. You don't have talent management, learning and development, organizational. Sure. You don't have all these like levers and COEs. You probably need to post every single role. That's probably your fair and consistent application there.
Okay.
If you work for a larger company, but they also have to have a documented process and probably some kind of matrix, or like not necessarily like an authorization matrix. That's a really corporate jargony word, but as long as there's a documented process on, we as talent management leaders meet on a quarterly basis and we go through these level jobs and we identify the successors for those roles. If that is documented and there's a consistent process of showing that, then you can just promote those people into those roles, because essentially someone is already identified. You can, they can interview internally, but again, that goes back to, are you doing that for every single role at that level or in that function? And that's where the easy part that you've probably heard is just, no, we just post everything, because it's just a blanket, it covers you. And then I think it's also left up to, I think a best practice is 5 days to post an opening.
Yeah, that's what I always heard.
And that's what I follow as well. I've heard some will say 7, I've heard some will say 3, but really, again, consistent and uniform. But it is true. You don't technically have to post everything, but you really have to have that documented succession process. And that's in partnership with your talent management group. So then that's the other piece. You've got to make sure that your COEs are talking to each other.
I mean, really, that just like I said, a misconception I had. And to your point, I think I understand now where that came from, but wow, that was super helpful. Okay. So I've got more questions, but we're starting to get some questions from our audience here. So I'm going to table some of the stuff I have and shoot some of these your direction. I do want to just mention again, for those of you who are just joining us, I've got Emily Truelove, the manager of talent acquisition here locally for L3 Harris, recent transplant from Dallas Fort Worth, will be at Silicon Slopes. Go introduce yourself. Let's give her a warm Utah reception. And she's talking about compliance today. And I say she, we're talking about it, but she's the one who's educating me right now. So like I said, Emily, we've got some great questions that we're starting to see here. And if you can't, if these are like, if you're not sure, we'll just tell people, right? But I am curious. Okay, we've got a question here. If you see, and this is borderline on what we do, but again, I think your expertise, you're going to be able to address this. If you see bias in an organization, how do you recommend tactfully addressing this to HR?
That is a great question. I'm not going to call out any function in particular, but I have seen that in different organizations, both on the corporate side and on the agency side. So I think this is where you pull out the compliance hat. This is where you have to say, pull out the candidate funnel. Here, so if let's say you post a job, I'm kind of going hypothetical here. You post a role, you have 35 applicants, which right now, honestly, that's the dream. Where I think we're lucky to get a few. We're having to source so heavily right now since the talent market is unlike anything we've ever seen.
Indeed.
But let's say you've got 35 applicants, and then you look at those 35 and you decide, okay, out of these 35, these 12 meet the minimum qualifications that we advertised. And if you can document that funnel and say, here are the 12, and you screen them, or you decide based on that quick, and by screening, I'm meaning you don't have to have a 30-minute conversation with these folks. You can kind of do, I call it a pulse check of just, hey, you applied to this job. Are you interested? Here's the comp,
Sure.
Are we still on the same page here? I think once you get that 12 and then you determine, okay, these are the 5 that I want to present to the hiring manager because they're the most on target. And if you find that consistently that hiring manager is picking a certain type of candidate, if you can demonstrate that trend, metrics are everything. If you can show those metrics, if you can show a pattern and do it in a very informative way of, hey, I was told if I see something, say something. So this is what I see. This is what I'm bringing up. And then put it on the business partner, put it on the ethics advisor and say, how do you recommend, here are the steps that I've taken. I've talked through why I've presented these candidates. That the more that you can add to that partnership will then become credible. But I'm telling you, metrics, everything.
Perfect. And just to be clear, so everything you just talked about, I think is phenomenal. And it's a position that we as talent acquisition professionals can be in. For those that are not, and I think that question may have come from somebody who's not, I think the critical piece here is to come to your HRBP or whomever it is at your organization.
Ethics advisor. There's typically a hotline. Yeah.
And rather than come from an accusatory perspective, talk about it in terms of what you have, what you believe you have witnessed. And then to your point, Emily, I think maybe making them aware that I think we might need some more metrics around this because I could be wrong, right? This is just something that I've observed. And I'm curious if we maybe look into it a little bit more. So that would be the way I would recommend for those of you who are not in talent acquisition or in that function, having that conversation. It's like, it's a terrible analogy, but it's like when you're having an argument with your significant other, you don't want to tell them what they did. You want to tell them how it made you feel, right? So rather than come accusatory, just make sure that you're kind of saying, hey, this is what I've observed. I believe I'm seeing something here. Can we look into it more and pull up some metrics and maybe get to the bottom of it? So that's phenomenal. Okay, great. And thank you for the question. Okay, next question. This one, none of these are going to put you on the spot, Emily. We're good here. Okay, so I'm just going to read it verbatim, make sure that I get it right. What are the compliance points that impact a company's DEI goals and programs?
So diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you typically, we would call that an FAAP requirement. So there is a lot, this also depends on the company of your size. So there's typically like, I'm going to talk through this. So typically the buckets are veterans, gender, ethnicity, and disability are kind of the buckets that you'll see most kind of through the goal.
Sure.
There are companies that have teams that essentially go through and say, we will do an analysis of each of the different roles that we have. We will do a comparison of the percentages of those 4 different places, and kind of see where are we currently employing those folks? What is the average, across the industry? There's a lot of just research that goes into determining, okay, do we need to do a benchmark here? Or do we need to make sure? There's also equal pay analysis that goes into that. So I should throw that in there, that's also, compensation is typically a conversation. But we, as talent acquisition professionals, have to be armed with that information. So that has to come filtered down. And then we as managers have to make our recruiters feel empowered to have that conversation in the intake meeting, or kickoff meeting is what we'll call that. But for them to know, okay, this role falls into this bucket, which results in this goal, given all of the information that we've gathered. And so communicating that to the hiring manager and saying, this is our goal for this role. And I will make a conscious effort from a sourcing perspective to make sure that I present you with a slate that will allow you that opportunity to hit that goal.
I love it. It goes back to your point you've got to start with a baseline, and those metrics are so critically important. And so to your point, or to answer the question directly with regard to what are the compliance points around this,
yeah, I think like those are there's not compliance really doesn't play a hand in the goal, perhaps. Compliance plays more of a hand of, is after an audit, or if there's I saw something, say something, if there's evidence of candidates being passed over because of those pieces, that's when compliance would get involved, and there'd be some kind of adverse action.
Perfect.
This is also why it's critical in a job description that if there are limitations to perform the job, that those things are listed, so that if you do get someone that applies, that again, there's the hotbed for the lawsuit. And I never say that with the intention to be
scare.
And it's not meant to be scary. It's meant to just be realistic of saying, look, this is why it's critical that we get this right, because we are opening our door up.
I mean, you just touched on a soapbox issue for me personally, which is creating a hiring profile, because you mentioned it earlier with when you talked about being objective.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody will it's human nature to compare candidates among one another if you haven't done the work up front to create that profile and compare to the profile, right?
Yes. And that is where it's so critical for us to educate hiring managers, especially those that are new, is that we are measuring these individuals against the job description. We are not measuring them against each other. Yep. Now, as you go through the process of doing that general screen, doing a technical screen, doing a panel interview, doing an on-site interview, whatever the process is, again, uniform, consistent. As you get through, that's when you start to say, well, the job that we're asking these people to do, here's, this person has done this, that, that's when you start to kind of, you don't want to measure folks against each other, but ultimately that you are measuring against the job description. How quickly can they hit the the goals and the day-to-day that you've set in that JD.
No, it's perfect. And again, for everybody who is watching right now, talent acquisition professionals. Now I am, to be clear, I'm with a third party. So I'm not going to necessarily, I'm happy to answer questions, but whomever it is at your organization that does this, we're same team, right? You can come to us with any kind of question, and we're going to just, to your point, Emily, I love that you said, we're going to educate you on what it looks like. Kind of like I'm being educated here today by Emily Truelove, manager of talent acquisition at L3 Harris. And again, we've got some more questions, or actually just one more question. But for those of you watching, if you have questions, we've got to wrap this thing up pretty quick. Emily's a busy lady. She doesn't have all day. But I want to ask one more question, Emily, and then we'll get to some of the stuff maybe we talked about beforehand that we missed that you think is absolutely critical to get out there. Oh boy, another question came in. This one should be pretty quick.
Okay.
We were talking earlier about, well, I'm good if you're good. I'm very cognizant of your schedule, right? So this one is, we were talking earlier about internal hiring versus like external hiring and posting jobs, et cetera. The question is, what if it's not an internal hire, but a network referral? Does that still need to be posted? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to pitch it to you, Emily.
So if they are not internal to the organization, they are considered not an employee. It must be posted.
I'm glad I didn't answer that question because I would have been wrong. So just to be clear, my answer was going to be, it depends, but yeah, that was perfect. I'm glad we got that one done quickly. And then this one just came in. Okay, let me just see if I can clarify before I'm asking. So as a candidate, how are we finding the right candidates? Okay. So basically the question is, it sounds like this individual is kind of wondering how they can stand out as a candidate, if I'm understanding correctly. And they're asking as a candidate. So what would be some of your recommendations on that?
So when you are a job seeker, that is your full-time job. Like, think of it that way. You do not want to haphazardly just apply to jobs. Don't just blanket apply to roles. As I think I can speak for most like talent acquisition professionals, we're so good at multitasking, and we have these skill trap memories. We remember candidates, we remember names. So just be very deliberate when you apply for roles. Also, if your skills and experience don't necessarily match 100% to the job that you're seeking or the job that you want, what you need to do is look at that job description. What are they asking for? And then you need to translate what you've done. I think what's critical is the information is right there for the taking. The company has advertised, this is what you're going to be doing. And if you're just throwing the same resume out there that doesn't have anything that we as a recruiter can look at and say, oh, I see they did this, we don't know how that ties to the job. We are truly looking for what the hire, and because we're not experts in all of those different disciplines that we recruit for, we really rely on the information that's provided to us. So use that job description as, have I done this? And if I have, going back to probably where I was saying, don't put corporate jargon into those job descriptions, but elaborate what you've done. Hey, I know you're asking for this, but here's what I've done that's yielded results that you're looking for.
Perfect. I love it. And again, I think we talked about it on this platform before. There's a lot about a job search that is simple, but not easy. One of the biggest ones for sure is taking the time to, tailor your resume to a specific job description, and using Emily's advice that she just gave. I would say, in my personal opinion, that is one of two most critical things you can do on your resume. So yeah, that's fantastic.
I
So
mean, yeah, you're spot on. I like, if I'm quick, in my previous life, before I jumped into the recruiting side, I did a lot of general management and like office management, where I was this like Jill of all trades, new ops, new front of house, new kind of behind the scenes pieces. But I also had a really good career in sales. I had two different resumes, so that as I was like looking for different opportunities, I had this like operations kind of manager, general manager type of like profile, but then I also had the sales profile. So it's
yep.
again, like, don't just haphazardly throw it out there, be very deliberate.
Yep, it's perfect. So, okay, we've got to wrap this up because again, you only have so much time. I only have so much time. I
Yes.
do just want to reiterate again for those of you who have joined kind of later. Today we had a conversation all around compliance. My guest today was Emily Truelove, who is a manager of talent acquisition over at L3 Harris here in Utah. I've said it a bunch already. I'll say it again. She's a recent transplant from the Dallas-Fort Worth area here to Salt Lake City. She will be at Silicon Slopes. Make sure, let's give her a warm Salt Lake City, Silicon Slopes welcome when you see her either there or virtually. We've talked about compliance. We've covered a lot. We didn't cover everything we had planned to. So what did we miss that you think is critical before we wrap this thing up, Emily?
I think if we reiterate anything, it's like twofold. As a talent acquisition professional, no matter if you are the HR person and you do everything, or you're simply you're a recruiter, or you work for an agency, if you don't feel empowered, empower yourself to speak up and to speak directly and talk the why behind all of the reasons we have to do the things that we do to stay in compliance. I think that has been where I've had success, because I've had hiring managers just butt heads with me and go, but this is the way we've always done it, and I've never had to do this, and I don't understand why. But when you talk about it from a compliance lens and say, like, just like you have to follow rules, I have to follow rules. This isn't just a free for all where we just pick people out of a hat and say, here you go, here's a job. It's you just, if you don't feel empowered, empower yourself. And if you don't, then maybe like we can help you write your resume or get you a job somewhere else, if we're honest. But you feel like you can speak up and speak to the why behind we have to make the decisions around compliance. I think that's important. And I think that also increases your trust and your partnership with your internal or external clients, for that matter. I think another kind of piece, maybe I'm trying to think of like what we didn't cover. If I reiterate anymore, just like be consistent with your processes. Yeah. Document why and follow it, and just keep it consistent and uniform.
Perfect. No, I think it's great. And to your first point, great start for anybody who doesn't feel like they know exactly what they're doing around compliance. Just watch this conversation. I appreciate your expertise, Emily. Thank you so much for being here. Folks, we're going to wrap this thing up. And as always, I'll be back in a couple of weeks, most likely with Kelly Sanchez. But, depending on how much fun Emily had today, maybe we'll come back and talk about a different topic in the future. In the meantime,
are you sure we could do legal? We'll just keep on the compliance train here. It's so exciting.
You're right. I think this is probably a fan favorite, right?
Yeah.
But seriously, this is my opinion. She's not the only manager of talent acquisition at L3 Harris, but she is the best. So,
well, thank you. No,
make sure you.
I've got lots of peers around me. We all lift each other up. I have an amazing team and peers and leadership. So
exactly what the best would say. All right, you'll see her at the Silicon Slopes Summit. We'll all be there in September. Otherwise, I'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. As always, let us know if there's any other topics that you want us to cover in the future. And Emily, thanks so much for being here.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. See you. Bye.